Okay, some troubling terminology then. Let's have a look at the word qualia. The singular is quale. This is a word that I hope by the end of this video that you're able to use the word, or at least get understand it, and not be confused. Right, if you read it somewhere, or if you hear me, you'll hear me saying it in the videos to come. So I hope that this word just begins to become more familiar with you. The word qualia is, if you go to the Wikipedia entry, it's a long debate. There's a history of philosophical discourse over the word qualia, argument even over whether qualia really exist, what qualia really means, and so on. I'm not really going to rehash all of that. I'm not interested in much of that for our purposes. I just want to give a bit of a sense of what the word is pointing at, to what thing in the universe this word is supposed to direct us and bring our attention to. So the word qualia then refers to some sense to the inner quality of a particular experience. And one way to think of that is to use a term we've already been using, and that's this idea of the world out there and the world in here. And it will encompass much more than this, but we'll have a look at this first. If we've got my coffee cup out there in the world, the real coffee cup made of atoms and things, then in our brain there is a representation of that coffee cup. And I mean, we have an experience of the coffee cup that looks like the coffee cup out there, but in our brains that doesn't exist. In our brains we have I accidentally deleted that. In our brains we have patterns of activity, but we don't see patterns of activity. We see a bright, illuminated, visual experience of a convincing, coherent coffee cup. Our brain produces some kind of reality, some kind of virtual representation of the coffee cup. If we compared this to, say, a robot, if this is our robot's eyes, these are kind of photosensitive detectors, and those feed out to a bunch of wires, a bunch of circuitry, and that feeds off to, say, two wheels and allow the robot to move forward and backwards depending on what its light detector sense. We generally don't suppose, at least at this point in history, that these robots are having a conscious, that there is a character to their experience of that light entering there. We think it's just kind of operating in the dark. Inside the mind of that robot, it is dark, and it's just circuits informing wheels to turn on and off and so on. Now, this actually comes up in philosophy as the idea of what's called the philosophical zombie. We think that, while we may have ourselves a very clear idea that we have this conscious experience, we can't really say that for other people. I'm not going to go into all of that. But the question does arise, why are we not operating in the dark like this robot? How is it that we've come to have, there is a character to the awareness that we have of sensory information? How does sensory information produce an actual experience? How do our brains produce an experience of sensory information? Why are we not operating in the dark? So like I say, that's kind of the main idea of qualia. The word qualia points at this. Visually, it would point at this projection our minds produce of visual information, but there are many other types of experience that we can have that the word qualia might point at. I was over on the Stanford Encyclopaedia earlier, and there's some very good, I'll post this link, it's quite a good article, and he talks about the idea that qualia could point at perceptual experiences, like we've just said, experiences of the sort involving seeing the colour green, hearing loud trumpets, tasting licorice, smelling sea air, handling a piece of fur. There's a stock phrase that comes up at this point. So there is something it is like, and that's the phrase. It said that there is something it is like. It is like something to experience red, and we know what it is like. It might be very difficult to describe red to somebody else, but we know what it's like to have the conscious visual representation of red produced in our minds, and that's different from the colour green, say. And this something it is like phrase comes into qualia quite a lot. I think it came from a paper by Thomas Nagel called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And this idea that there is something it is like to have some experience also helps us to kind of get to the grips of what qualia is pointing at, what this word is pointing at. So This article goes on to say that there are other things, other experiences that there is something it is like to have them. So bodily sensations, for example, feeling a twinge of pain, feeling an itch. There is something it is like to feel an itch as a conscious being that is different from what it would be like for our robot operating in the dark. And if we move down a little bit, there is something it is like to have the experience of understanding a sentence. Okay, if you look at a sentence in Chinese, unless you don't read Chinese, it will be a very different experience from reading a sentence in English that you actually understand. There is the experience of suddenly thinking of something, of suddenly remembering something, and these are experiences that we're familiar with. We know what they're like. They might be difficult to describe, but nevertheless, there is something it is like to have them. And the word qualia really points at that experience, that over and above just the patterns of activity in the brain. It kind of, if we subtract the pattern of activity, what we're left with, the actual experience itself, is the qualia of that particular experience. Another way, just to kind of try and bring it home a bit more, what qualia means, because we will be using it a lot, is to say, I like the example of the machine in the Matrix, okay? This is perhaps not a common example, but the machine in the Matrix, in some sense, was a qualia-producing machine. Nowadays, virtual reality machines are done by if we had the eyes and the brain, we would have a virtual reality machine would feed an image into the eyes. We'd have a screen, perhaps, that's very close to the eyes on a visor, and that would feed image to the brain, and our brain would perhaps begin to take that as that's the environment that we're in. In the Matrix, we saw that the machine kind of entered the back of the head, and we could, even though it's a fictional machine, this machine seems to kind of go directly to the qualia producing centers of the brain, whatever those are, wherever that machinery is in the brain that produces this experience, this representation of reality. The Matrix machine seemed to tap directly into that. So when Neo saw the woman in the red dress, his eyes didn't need to be receiving any information at all. His eyes are closed as he's lying on the bed. We could cut off the senses and just stimulate the virtual reality centers of the brain, the qualia producing centers of the brain, and that would give rise to this experience. And to some degree, this has already been done. If we wanted to have the conscious, if we wanted our brains, the virtual reality parts of our brain, to produce the conscious image for us of seeing a spot of light, then we could shine a spot of light on the eyes, and that would pass the signal along to the qualia producing centers, and lo and behold, emerging into consciousness would be the experience of a spot of light. If we could bypass the eyes completely and insert some kind of microelectrode into those neurons of the brain that became active by the spot of light, and rather than having the eyes stimulate that region via a cascade of signals caused by the light, we could just bypass that and stimulate those same neurons artificially. And that has been done, and it produces the same experience of a spot of light or a cloud of light that is a fully conscious visual experience. So the Matrix machine could really be thought of, in some sense, as a qualia-producing machine, and could be thought of as the ultimate end, technologically, of this kind of experiment, of this kind of technology. So this is the word qualia, and I invite you to look out upon your visual scene now and notice that it seems very much like you are looking out through your eyes upon the world. But like we said in the first video, it is that we are not looking out through our eyes at the world. The photons, all of the brightness of photons cease to exist at the tip of the nervous system, at the retina, and everything beyond that occurs in complete darkness. There are no photons, there is no light in the middle of the brain. They're all absorbed and converted into energy by the neurons. So this thing that you're seeing, the objects around you, that the representation your brain is creating of those is what you have, and it exists within the physical space that your brain occupies. But again, our brain makes it seem like we're looking out and like this image is beyond us and outside of us, but it's not the case. And I invite you just to kind of maybe spend a little bit of time every now and then just considering that, considering the qualities of qualia, asking what is qualia made of. If we have a movie screen, we know that the image on that screen that comes from a projector is made of light and photons, but in our minds it's less clear, through what angle the brain points its beam to create this image. So I'll leave it at that for qualia. I hope that it just gives you some idea that there is this phenomena that seems to occur in the universe, that this experience that can be produced by the motions of atoms or whatever it is by the brain can actually create this experience. We'll elaborate a bit more on this in the next video on the hard problem of consciousness.